Hello, welcome. My name's Vivian Parry. I'm a science writer and broadcaster, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event organised by Frontiers in collaboration with Keystone Symposia. Now, when Frontiers, the digital open access publisher and open science platform, was thinking about an event on AI in those long ago days before COVID, they wanted to be able to go beyond the hype that surrounds AI. But then along came Corona, the end of in-person events, but also an opportunity arose, because this was an opportunity to think about AI in the context of the pandemic, showing where it had and hadn't made a contribution and what it might mean for the future in terms of embedding AI in healthcare, in thinking about whether AI might accelerate open science, its public acceptability, and where all this might lead in terms of future policy. Then came a collaboration with Keystone Symposia, which is a non-profit headquartered in Colorado that convenes around 60 open access, peer-reviewed conferences across many life science topics. And here we all are now. We've got real live examples of how AI has fared during the pandemic. And with those examples, we can discuss the promise of AI in pandemic times beyond the hype. So we're going to be showcasing those real world examples. But to start us all off, I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, who is going to lay out the kind of context for us. And then we're going to have some conversations afterwards with various experts who'll be showing those real world examples. Then we're going to have a conversation with a panel, and then it's over to you, because I want you to take part in this very important discussion. So please welcome Stefan Peterson, who's professor at the William Harvey Research Institute, that's in London, and he's a particular expert in the AI of as applied to cardiovascular imaging. Stefan.
Thank you very much, Vivian. It's a great pleasure to be able to give a brief talk on the promises of AI in health. These are my disclosures, which I do not think represent a real conflict of interest related to this topic. COVID-19 has created enormous suffering, affecting lives and causing deaths. The ease with which this type of coronavirus can spread has exposed weaknesses of many healthcare systems around the world. Since its emergence, many governments, research communities, commercial enterprises, and other institutions and stakeholders around the world have been fighting in various ways to curb the spread of the disease. Science and technology have helped in the implementation of policies in many governments that are directed towards mitigating the impact of the pandemic and in diagnosing the disease and providing care for affected patients. In this talk, I will give two examples of areas where AI techniques are being used in the diagnosis and epidemiological predictions and forecasting for combating COVID-19. I will highlight challenges that need to be addressed to achieve significant progress in battling COVID-19 and future pandemics using AI that are relevant also to a wider range of AI applications in healthcare. Medical imaging is one of the main areas in which AI has found practical applications in medicine and healthcare. Medical imaging modalities such as chest CT and chest X-ray have provided significant support to clinicians in diagnosing COVID-19. As an example here, the AI system presented in the reference published in Nature Communications by Jin and colleagues and summarized here on this slide classifies chest CT into the following four categories: non-pneumonia, non-viral community-acquired pneumonia or CAP, influenza A and B, and COVID-19. So this is an example of a challenging multi-class labeling task. The dataset consists of 10,250 CT scans from 3 centers in China and 3 publicly available external databases. As a measure of accuracy, on an internal testing dataset of 3,200 images, the AI system achieved an area under the curve, or AUC, of about 97%, a sensitivity of 90% and a specificity of 96%. This second example addresses a real need that occurred in parts of England recently. The Independent newspaper reported the major incident declared over oxygen supply fears at London's Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Just yesterday, the BBC reported of a similar problem at Southend Hospital. Oxygen supply is not endless at times when many patients require oxygen. Thus, the ability to predict oxygen requirement at patient and hospital level is critical. In this example, researchers at NVIDIA and Mass General and Brigham Hospital in Boston have developed an AI model that determines whether a person showing up in the emergency room with COVID-19 symptoms will need supplemental oxygen hours or even days after an initial exam. Developed within 20 days in a global collaboration with 20 hospitals, this work resulted in an excellent prediction for the level of oxygen required by incoming patients. The area under the curve as a measure of accuracy was 94%. Although we have only given 2 examples, several promising and encouraging AI-based techniques and frameworks for the detection, diagnosis, and epidemiological predictions, forecasting, and social control of COVID-19 have been proposed in the fight against the disease. In fact, the majority of AI applications developed have focused on predicting national and local statistics, such as the number of confirmed cases, deaths, and people recovered from COVID-19. For many of these AI techniques to gain wide acceptance and use in practical clinical settings, however, there would need to be a framework on how these models could be incorporated into clinical pathways and IT solutions. AI has huge potential in the battle against the COVID-19 pandemic, but successful practical deployments of these AI-based tools have so far been limited, we have to admit. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of addressing the following challenges. First, data accessibility. One of the key challenges that AI experts have faced during the COVID-19 pandemic is the lack of access to sufficiently large data sets for training and external validation of AI models upon which successful and thus deployable applications depend. The reasons for this are multifactorial. 2, external evaluation. Many of the developed AI-based techniques and models for COVID-19 diagnosis and epidemiological forecasting have not been externally evaluated. External model evaluation helps in assessing the generalizability of the predictions on independent data sets and ensures that the model has learned the underlying features of the process that produces the data rather than memorize the features of a particular set of data. 3, AI regulatory landscape. Many AI experts and clinicians, me included, are unaware of the complex regulatory landscape governing the development of AI tools in healthcare and have not considered this matter in their development. 4, collaboration between AI experts and clinicians. I think this point is particularly important. It's not sufficient, in my view, for clinicians to hand over data to AI experts who understand how to develop and use classical AI algorithms. In my opinion, it's important for clinicians to work with AI experts to help them understand the context of the solutions being developed, to help them interpret the results from those solutions, and to guide them on how those solutions could be used and integrated into existing clinical healthcare pathways or workflows. And 5, public engagement over privacy concerns. A framework that will ensure transparency of the legal basis of data use, that data collection is safe, and that there are controls and mechanisms to protect misuse of data is critical now and in the future. The The main lessons learned on the application of AI-based techniques and frameworks for the detection, diagnosis, and epidemiological predictions, forecasting, and social control of COVID-19 are: healthcare centers need dedicated teams with expertise in medical data collection, privacy, access and sharing, and data governance frameworks and protocols for pandemic and other emergency times need to be designed and put in place. External model evaluation is important to avoid the problems associated with model overfitting and biasness, such as arriving at clinically unusable solutions or introducing inequalities in health and healthcare. The regulatory landscape, covering issues such as safety, effectiveness, benefit versus harm analysis, and so on, governing the development of AI tools in healthcare, need to be accessible and understandable. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of domain-specific knowledge in AI, but multidisciplinary research collaborations will accelerate the translation of AI research into practical and useful solutions in healthcare. The authorities would need to bring along the public, the patients, and all stakeholders in the development of a framework for AI solutions that will gain the trust of the population in terms of data collection, privacy, and protection. I would like to thank you for your attention, but my colleague Musa Abdul Karim deserves a special thank you. In my team, he is the principal research scientist and helped review and summarize the enormous amount of literature to allow this presentation to be put together.
Stefan, thank you so much. That was such a good presentation because it's really laid out the ground for us for our discussions as we go on in this event. What I want to do now is to have a couple of conversations. And the first person that I want to introduce you to is Michael Rosen-V, who's Director of Healthcare Informatics IBM Research and visiting professor at the Faculty of Medicine at the Hebrew University. And her particular specialty, I guess, is medical imaging. So, Michael, delighted to have you here with us. We heard there about one example, CT imaging, chest imaging, that was used extensively in China. Are there other examples of where AI in medical imaging is making a difference in for COVID?
Yes, I was very impressed by the example that was given on this activity because this showed the power of AI technologies in diagnosing and labeling and understanding the disease. What we have looked at in the past year is how much effort was devoted to AI in imaging and how much was achieved. Unfortunately, not all studies achieved these high quality results that were presented here. And we believe that the reason is that there are many barriers to achieve these changes, to achieve impact and support to the physicians and the radiologists. And what we have seen, and we actually looked at how many papers are there on AI in medical imaging for COVID-19, we've seen that there are thousands of papers in the literature for 2019, in order of 2,600, and these numbers increased in 2020. But on COVID-19, we found more than 500 such papers, and then we wanted to understand their qualities. So we reviewed each and every paper on AI in COVID-19 on imaging for chest, and this summed up for the first 3 quarters to 300 plus papers. And we found that a very small number, only 13, were as mature as the one that was presented. It was from October, so we didn't review that one. The one from Nature Communication that was discussed was October. And the reason that there were so few is that there's a need of putting in place collaborations and creating an opportunity to collect data and learn from the data. And also, since the disease was new to the physicians and to the old world, the second thing and the last thing I want to say about it, about the need, is that there is a need to create some structure and standardization of how we assess severity and how we learn from that with AI, because AI learns from people in most of the settings. It's a learning system. On COVID, the definition of COVID, the severity of COVID only recently was well defined.
So that's an interesting point you're making, because really I guess the system was being trained only on severe cases, so we weren't seeing the asymptomatic cases, so we don't know what we don't know, and therefore the system might have been biased, and we just don't know that.
That's totally true. And one way to address that is by comparing what we have of COVID to what we have from past data. So there are studies where, and I think in this study as well in the Nature Communication and other studies where you just take chest CTs of people without COVID prior to COVID last year's and chest CT today. But the bias you talk about is totally true, and that's a challenge for AI in general.
So what we're being presented with during the pandemic in some ways is only the very best, and we're not seeing a long tail of those things which actually haven't been successful, either because, for some of the things that Stefan pointed out, perhaps insufficient clinician involvement, or difficult access to data sets on which to train the AI. So is the pandemic revealing AI in a good light, do you think? Or do you think it's simply, taking away its clothes, as it were, and there is the emperor, but perhaps it's got no clothes on? Where are we? What do you think it's done to the whole field of AI by giving us these kind of real-time examples?
I think that the strengths and the advantages of AI became very clear, but at the same time also the disadvantages, as you said, and as Stefan said. So if we look at data availability, that's a key for being successful with AI technologies. And just taking as an example, in breast, it took 10 years to design and accumulate the data and learn from the data. And then there are many technologies in screening mammography and that the technology has reached the levels of the radiologist. So it was shown in a number of papers in the past year that you have reached there, but it took 10 years and it took a lot of data to get there. Tens of thousands of women, data was collected from them in order to understand that. COVID, it was very hard at the same time that we just learn about the disease and the hospitals are crowded to also put in place all these systems to collect the data. So if we think of what we need to learn from next pandemic, God forbid, I hope we won't have, but if we need to prepare for the next pandemic, is to have these systems ready at place so that we can download and use the data in parallel to the physicians, the frontliners are addressing and reacting to the disease. The AI crowds of people can also react to the disease in analyzing and studying. And that was not ready in this disease. And that's why we saw so many efforts that did not mature, as you said, that this the long tail.
And interesting that in both cases, both in breast cancer and the pandemic, it's been driven by urgent needs. So in breast cancer, the critical shortage of radiologists is what's really propelled that forward. Whereas, of course, the pandemic, it's just the overwhelming urgency and need to diagnose. But if we, perhaps thinking about other areas where there is a real need, how do we go about getting those data sets? I mean, we can have these kind of, these false data sets that are not real, that are kind of dummy data sets. Should we be using more of those?
That's a big debate in the community and a very good question. So emulating data and simulating data that represents what we believe are the signals that the real data contain, and learning from that is a mechanism that some people are using. Since we don't really understand everything in that data, so it's not like that we understand how cancer evolves and how it affects the tissue and what we will see in the images, that puts at risk, if you develop your technology on data that is simulated and not the real one, potentially might have not captured the real complexities in the data. So there are other ways to address the need of big data and the need of annotation of data in this world. One thing, of course, key and important is to work with the clinicians and the physicians. So we've seen that the best papers out there that made the biggest impact are those where you had multidisciplinary teams. So that's definitely a key request. It's not only about data working with physicians. The second point that I want to make, it's not only about the working with the right people, is also to benefit from the most advanced technologies that contain transfer learning, self-learning, where what you have learned in one place can be captured and help you in a different areas. And these novel methods that also include causal inference, where you learn, for instance, in this condition, if we step back from radiology and go and think about drugs, there's a whole big challenge of finding new indications for existing drugs. So COVID-19 patients might benefit from existing drugs, but we don't know about that. If we can learn with causal inference, try to see retrospectively in the data of patients what helped these patients, then we can find other ways to assist the patients.
So AI has the potential to tell us much more than we're currently asking. Definitely. And I want to ask you the big question here. So get your crystal ball out and give it a good polish, because where do you see the field of AI evolving? Having had this searing experience of the pandemic and having seen in real time where it can be useful, how do you think that that's guided where AI is going to evolve in the future in medical imaging?
Yeah, so I think that it's going to be less academic and more practical. So in the past, in the academic world, you have areas, I understand the image and use AI for image, or I understand clinical data, or I understand genomic data, or I understand social determinants of health and how they affect. Now, when we think about the urgent need that the pandemic has raised, we understand that it's not an academic question. You don't sit in your ivory tower and try to resolve something. You see the immediate impact of what you resolve. And that means that there will be much more connectivity between technologies. It will not be only imaging or only clinical data and so on. It will be connecting them.
And do you see any areas where AI is not going to be moving forward because people have seen it in action in the pandemic? Where has been a kind of a break, perhaps, on AI?
I think that the AI tends to break when there's no digital data, and the data is what we call soft, is not well recorded. So I saw a lot of debates in each and every country about the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And non-pharmaceutical interventions, in principle, could have been recorded. And there are some AI studies where it was published in latest venues, what we have found with the technology of AI. But I didn't see any country or politicians who say, I believe this method and I'm going to follow it, unlike the radiologist, where there's trust in some communities and there's usage. So deciding on policy where social determinants of health play a significant role, that's a much more complex, and I didn't see the connectivity.
So I think what I'm hearing from you there is that there are definitely low-hanging fruit with regard to AI and medical imaging, those particularly difficult things, pathology, CT scans, all those kind of things. That's absolutely its prime territory. Michal, thank you so much for that. I want you to come back and join us on our panel in a little while. But I now want to introduce another area, and can I say goodbye to you, Michal, and ask Thomas Hartung to join us. Hello, Thomas. So one of the areas that we have seen a great use of AI, and it's been particularly important, is the use of AI to accelerate drug discovery and development. And Thomas Hartung is a perfect person to be with us today. He's Professor of Pharmacology and Toxicology at the University of Constance in Germany. But for the purposes of this event, I think his chief attribute is that he's specialty chief editor in Frontiers, a journal in artificial intelligence, medicine and public health. So welcome to you, Thomas. Just let me ask you first of all, what was the sort of lay out the field for us, as it were, in silico drugs and vaccines discovery before COVID? So where were we before?
I mean, the enormous challenge by COVID was to overcome a process which typically takes 10 to 12 years to get to a drug or a vaccine. And this is something we obviously have overcome. By December, we had 3 vaccines accepted. We have several drugs which have received some authorizations by repurposing them. So we have really done a miracle as a medical community. And this cannot be done by just using the same tools. It is in part due to the fact that we have allowed new tools to come to bear.
And what has been the difference that AI has made? I mean, obviously, one is speed, but is there more than that?
They would not claim that AI was the driving factor, but it is obviously one of the new kids on the block. AI has really made an impact only over the last 5 to 8 years in these areas of drug development. And companies are very different in how they embrace these technologies. The important thing is if you make it very simple, AI is making big sense from big data. And the new quality is really big data. And these big data come from curated databases. These data come from sensor technologies. They come from the omics technologies, the high content imaging, as we just heard. And all of these different data in their variety and combined in transfer learning help us to identify new connections, forming new hypotheses about the use of a drug we have already in hands, or alerts us of safety problems which we would not have seen otherwise.
But what AI isn't doing here is replacing toxicology.
No, Stefan Platz from AstraZeneca very nicely said, AI is not going to replace toxicologists, but toxicologists who are using AI are going to replace those who are not. And I think that's exactly what it's about. It is an extremely important tool because it helps us to really understand data sets which the human brain can no longer handle and which we cannot just handle with normal descriptive statistics.
What are the limits of AI in drug discovery?
I mean, the first thing is you need to have data and you need to have the answer in the data. To take an example, you can certainly predict the stock market if you feed in weather forecasts. Because if you have enough data, AI will always squeeze some type of answer out of it. But obviously the answer is not in the stock in the weather forecast. And we need to be very careful. If we don't feed relevant information into it, we will not get correct answers. That's why we need the expert to judge this. Our data sets also come with a lot of biases. If we are feeding first world data into our computer programs, we will not get the answer for third world countries. We will get recommendations which are not feasible here. So all of these biases are extremely important to understand and to sort out, or to understand, yes, it is with the limits of this data set. And the third one, which I would like to mention is about causality. The biggest problem for us is to understand why our algorithms came to a certain conclusion. And here we are improving, but we are far from a general understanding how to make sense of the conclusions of the computer.
It's not the one thing with AI. You do need a thing like our teachers used to tell us, show me your workings. And actually, AI, the one thing it's not very good at is showing us its workings. So there is a constant need for cross-checking, for quality assurance, for all those kinds of things. And do you imagine that we will still need to continue to do that to the extent that we do now into the future? Or will perhaps some of that fade away as we become more secure in AI findings?
I mean, this is all about making our algorithms and trainings on these data sets more robust, about validating them to achieve high quality, that we know how much we can trust and what are the critical questions we should pose. People are uneasy to have a self-driving car for good reasons, because it is trained on only a certain set of situations. And for good reason, they should also be skeptical if somebody says it's just AI going to prescribe your medicines and predict what you're going to do. But a doctor who uses AI might be in a very good situation. But it needs first the data. It was very teaching for me. End of November, I checked the number of scientific articles on COVID-19. These were, at the time, 75,000 in PubMed, our most important database. An enormous effort. Imagine, 10 months into this, and we have 75,000 articles accepted. But there were only 300 which were mentioning AI or machine learning at the time, which I found really disappointing. I'd expected much, much more. And then I said, obviously, we first need the data sets we can work our methods on. Now I checked again yesterday. We just passed 90,000 articles. It's now 20% more than 2 months ago, but we have 1,200 articles with AI and machine learning at the same time, which means a 300% increase in this. And this is exactly what is happening. As soon as we have reliable data, we can crunch the numbers and we can come up with quality which is publishable in order to help the scientific and medical community.
Now, one of the things that's been very clear from the whole pandemic experience is that regulators have had to move in a different way. They've had to accept information or data that's come to them that's been assisted through AI, but they've also, so that's meant a change in the way that they operate, but they've also been able to take decisions in a much speedier way. What do you think is going to happen to that kind of decision making with regulators post-pandemic? Because, with AI, we have been able to show that there is a different future. Do you think we're going to go back, or will we move forwards?
I mean, for some good reason, the whole field is very conservative. If you're talking about new medicines, if you talk about safety of these things, you don't want to rush decisions. You need something which does not fail, because the impact would be disastrous. But at the same time, we're not changing fast enough. Many of the safety assessments for drugs, which are still in place, have been introduced when I was not yet born or in kindergarten, and I'm 57 years old now. That's unheard of. We have seen that especially the FDA is moving, which is the most critical part, the roadblock for everyone. For the very simple reason, I'm here at Johns Hopkins in the US. We have 4.25% of the population, but we consume 48% of all drugs and 64% of drugs under patent. So this market is dominating. And that the FDA has now introduced programs to accelerate the acceptance of such new methodologies with their new program in December, for example, shows they have understood. And I don't think you can tell people this worked just for COVID, and for other drugs which are now in the pipeline, we are not going to accept. And this willingness to receive such data and to act on these data is enormously important. Because there's one key problem. The delay of a registration of a drug by 1 day is a loss of it around $1 million per day for the company. So it's extremely important they don't take a risk in their registrations if this could not be acceptable. So this is why both communities, those developing the drugs and those regulating them, are learning to go jointly without taking major risks for patients, but they're working using these new tools, and they see it is somehow working. It is leading to miracles, as I just said.
So the impact of the pandemic is extraordinary in many ways. We've seen it in so many areas, just accelerating areas that were subject to change that might have taken 3 to 5 years and has happened literally overnight. And drug discovery, it seems to me, is an area like that. And I think that AI is going to be there permanently now. That was such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Hartung. I want you to come back onto our panel later on, but we're going to have another keynote now, ladies and gentlemen. And our keynote is from Glenn Cohen. And it's about a subject very close to my heart. I'm very involved in public engagement, particularly in genomics and big data. and it's ensuring trustworthy AI in health. And Glenn Cohen is faculty director of the Petrie Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology and Ethics at Harvard Law School. Glenn.
Thank you very much for having me. First, some disclosures. Always good to start with that. Okay, so my talk is 6 hopes or 6 concerns and 1 hope. I'm a lawyer and an ethicist by training, so there's a lot of rain and clouds and a little bit of sunshine at the end. All right. First, caution. Biased data sets are a problem, but not the only one, and not the only source of bias. Of course, one of the most prominent concerns people have about integrating AI into medicine is that bias will seep in, particularly along racial and gender lines. And we saw this during COVID in the controversy over pulse ox measures and how they work for white patients versus black patients. We also saw it not in an AI setting, but an algorithmic setting in the Stanford vaccine rollout and ignoring residents and the like. And I think most people intuitively get the idea, and some of the prior speakers address this, that if it's garbage in, it's garbage out, that biased data sets have poor minority representation, that's going to lead to biased measures in healthcare and biased deployment. So people get that point, but in some ways that's version 1.0 of the problem and the easier one to solve. The harder problem, and I showed this paper from Science to kind of illustrate this, is the way in which choices about parameterization, for example, also make a big deal. So they found in an algorithm used by Optum that bias occurs because the algorithm uses health costs as a proxy for health needs. Less money is spent on black patients who have the same level of need, and the algorithm thus falsely concludes that black patients are healthier than equally sick white patients. Reformulating the algorithm so it no longer uses cost as a proxy for need eliminates the racial bias in predicting who needs extra care. So this is a problem that has nothing to do with the data set, but the way in which you parameterize. What are you aiming at? And as the authors know, this is something that was ex ante not a problem. If you'd polled people and said ahead of time, is this a good proxy? Most people would have said yes, but ex post, how it plays out, huge problem. And detecting these kinds of problems is much, much more difficult than merely testing your data set. Okay. Second example of a caution. If you build it, they may not come. This is the Exposure Notification Act. So I don't like the term digital contact tracing, but some people use that term. Built by Google and Apple, as well as others across the world built by other systems. And really there were 2 approaches. One was a more centralized approach favored by governments in China, South Korea, Taiwan, and elsewhere. The other was this decentralized, user-centric approach Apple, Google, and others put forward, where you would download the app, you would opt in, ... And what happened was, in fact, they didn't work. And the reason they didn't work was uptake really didn't happen. People didn't use it. And here there's a real trade-off between giving people autonomy and privacy on the one hand, and I'm sorry to say, effectiveness on the other. Digital systems cannot effectively augment traditional methods of contact tracing without widespread uptake. Oxford estimated that initially that about 80% of a population would have to have the app and use it regularly to suppress COVID-19. But the early results from Singapore showed that only 20% of the population had installed the app as of April 2020, sort of the first peak of the pandemic. And in many countries, the public was unlikely to accept a mandate to have to download and use these things. Moreover, the average user, not knowing the size of the network or sharing rates, is going to find it very difficult to interpret data from one of these apps. So it was a failure. It was a good effort by big tech, but one that was not responsive to the realities on the ground. Perhaps more troubling, we saw that the possibility of function creep, something introduced in COVID, could be used in a way we might not like in the future. And we saw this just last week when Singapore, it was reported, began sharing some of the data with police in a way that it promised it would not do when people signed on to the app. Okay. Third caution. All data may be health data. So this is a picture from a 2019 paper I did that I think tells the story very clearly. The main law that protects health data in the US, HIPAA, is sectoral and custodial. Only personal health information handled by covered entities or business associates are covered. That is traditionally the relationships we have with our healthcare providers, our doctors and our nurses and the records. But that's inadequate for a world where most of what permits inferences about our health lies below the waterline. health information from non-HIPAA covered entities, non-health information that permits inferences about health. Our shopping habits can tell us about whether we're pregnant. Our Instagram and posting styles and filter choices can help predict depression, as well as user-generated content like searches, Fitbits, the quantified self. If we want to protect people from having information about their health known, if it's their health we care about, protecting merely their health care information is inadequate. And the more intellectually interesting question, I think, is whether we want people to have a right against having inferences made about them. To what extent is that a privacy right versus a different kind of right, and how do we feel about it? Okay, next lesson. One of the greatest potential benefits of medical AI is the democratization of expertise, to give every American access to the skill of a pretty good dermatologist via AI, or at least tier by need, and indeed hopefully expand these services to the world in a way that exceeds our scale. COVID has shown us, though, that when push comes to shove, the old song, "We are the world," is a lie. We are not the world. We are at best a state, but in reality, we're just a sub-community. And the push towards vaccine nationalism shows us the truth of what William Gibson said. The future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. With AI, it will likely be what some people call data colonialism, using the data from many places in the world to build products that will then not be deployed or usable there, not just because the fact that we might have to sell the AI product, but because it's designed and integrated into a healthcare system does not match the local resources, the local setup or delivery of healthcare. And the same thing is likely to happen within the United States when we think of poorer regions and wealthier regions, as well as all over the world. So if we want to see a textbook example of the way when push comes to shove, we will become selfish, nationalistic, and tribalistic, COVID-19, I think, shows us the worst of this. Okay. Trust matters, but explainability may be elusive. COVID shows us how disinformation and mistrust can wreck public health success. A positive side discussion of AI trustworthiness is all the rage now. So you will hear tons of discussion about this. But I'm a cynic, and on the negative side, I will tell you that a lot of this is largely consultant speak and buzzwords with soft governance and little accountability. I'm also somewhat worried about the emphasis placed on explainability as the panacea and the end-all and be-all. It's unclear to me whether explainability is the best epistemic warrant or marker of trust for medicine. I intend to think it's more important to know that something works than how it works when it comes to medicine, so proof of results through RCTs and the like. And whether an explanation is acceptable and trustworthy will depend on the end user. What counts as a meaningful explanation for one individual or group, say a specialist or a physician, may not be meaningful for another, say a patient. And one of the reasons touted for requiring AI ML explainability is to facilitate accountability. But it's unclear to me how we get from explainability to accountability, especially when there are multiple components, multiple sub-black boxes involved. Finally, explainability as we know it now is really what I would call ersatz explainability. Algorithmically generated explanations offer post hoc rationales of these predictions rather than an actual reason for them. So I'm skeptical. Okay, last caution. You cannot escape the update problem. Even if you can overcome all of these problems with an initial approval or review framework, unless you're going to rely on a locked algorithm, which gives up much of the benefits of AI, you're going to face the question of what to do about adaptive AI, which learns as we want it to out in the world as it observes more instances. How do you design a regulatory framework that knows when enough has changed that some form of re-review is necessary? How do you make that process cost efficient in a way that won't deter companies from adopting learning AI? Can agencies like FDA or third-party auditors be trusted with that function? That is a very hard nut to crack. But I promised you some sunshine at the end, and here it is. So one great thing about COVID has been it has shown us the truth that many people would prefer and can successfully receive healthcare at home or otherwise outside of the doctor's office or healthcare setting. Barriers to telemedicine, legal, technical investment are coming down and coming down quickly. And this is a bridge to a world where most of our health will be available to us from home. Not just the version 2.0 we're seeing right now of telemedicine, but true ambient intelligence of the kind Hawk, Milstein, and Lee and others have been writing about. It'll start with hospitals themselves, then nursing homes, then the homes of elderly, then all of our homes, which will have sensors that are privacy savvy that collect data continuously and analyze it for deviations to predict harm. The early forays are into sanitation controls and fall sensors, but it won't stop there. The world of ambient intelligence is slowly becoming possible, though with that sunshine comes a bunch of ethical and legal challenges that we can talk about during the Q&A. But I'm incredibly excited about this momentum, and I think we all should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I mean, you've laid out a bunch of problems there. And how often have we heard that explainability is somehow the panacea for everything? And it goes back to that old deficit model, doesn't it? You know, that if we pour the jug of knowledge into the empty glasses of the public, then somehow immediately it will all be marvelous. And do you know what? That approach has never worked yet, but that's something we'll discuss a bit later. Now, I'm going to welcome Dr. Callum McRae. And Callum is the Chief of Cardiovascular Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And he's a cardiologist principally, but he's also a geneticist. And genomics discoveries really are reliant increasingly on AI. But what he's going to do for us is really introduce our panel session by drawing together some strands and thoughts about where we're going to go in the future, and some thoughts about on what you've heard already. Callum.
Vivian, thanks. As you heard from Vivian, my job is to transition from these outstanding keynotes and interviews to the panel discussion. Before we transition, I want to shamelessly plug the joint Keystone eSymposia in April on digital paths to improve human health and drug development in the digital age. Having done that, let's move to the panel discussion, which Vivian is going to moderate. I think in the last few minutes, we've heard some truly excellent insights into the role that AI has played and perhaps could have played in our response to the COVID pandemic. As we move to the panel, I wanted to frame a few general themes that have emerged for us to discuss. I think one of the core elements that really came through each of the sessions we've heard is what is really necessary to create and deploy the data collection infrastructure in healthcare and in biomedicine that's necessary for AI to even function. What will it take to move from an intrinsically local activity, which is really a design feature of modern medicine, to a robust global data stream that can ensure the rigor, the velocity, the representativeness of the data required so that healthcare can even approach other industries. And as Glenn just a few seconds ago emphasized, really all data are health data. Second area that I think we've touched on a couple of times is where can AI be injected into the workflow of public health, of epidemiology, healthcare more broadly, and biomedical discovery. I think simply adding AI upstream of the traditional users leaves the information at the mercy of human variation, which is really what we're trying to overcome. And it disrupts the very closed loops that we will ultimately need in order to build that continuous optimization at the heart of adaptive learning systems. How are we going to change our work to work with AI? And then I think the final theme that really threaded all the way through those early presentations were what are the societal, the cultural, the ethical frameworks that have to be developed so that AI can enter healthcare in a responsible manner. I think the utility of AI seems like an incredibly rational driver for inclusion, since so much of the information content that we're all interested in capturing is in the extremes. But how can we ensure that that's the case in every dimension? So with these initial frameworks, I'm going to pass this back to Vivian, who's going to moderate the conversation and the Q&A that follows. Thanks, Vivian.
I want to start with Stefan, and some of the, you outlined some of the issues about getting, about embedding AI, and not only embedding AI in healthcare, when it's developed, but also developing the data streams in a format that's appropriate. How do you think we can deal with that?
So I think this is very challenging, and a brief answer can't go through all of the issues. But if you think about it in one way, one is the development of AI solutions. And on the other hand, you've got AI solutions that may be already established, and how do you actually implement them into clinical workflows? I think both of these are key. To implement them, I think key is relationships. I can only sort of speak from my own experience at my own hospital. The IT services are constantly understaffed. And you even, to even get their ear to kind of discuss implementing something is quite challenging. So I think we need to build good relationships with data protection officer, with ICT services, and just explain the clinical need. So I think relationships are really important. And the second is infrastructure. And it's slightly different for whether you're developing AI tools or whether you have AI tools and you want to implement them. Because, I mean, I'm not an IT person as such, but my understanding is obviously when you're developing IE, you need much more powerful computing, GPU, and hospitals often don't have that. So you need to at least set up pipelines that allow you to use GPUs with clinical data. So maybe federated learning is one way to overcome the issue of data sharing and as a data controller, feeling that you're losing control over the data. And if you're implementing established AI tools, I think that's much easier. You need less powerful computers, is my understanding. And there it's all about getting ICT services, etc., convinced that there is a good case to implement these tools or certain tools and allow APIs, etc., connecting to the clinical data that these AI tools can be used. That was a long answer, but it covered some of my thoughts.
And I guess we also have to get the IT departments out of the basements. I mean, we do. They're not highly regarded people, and those that are particularly good are often, paid a great deal more than most health systems pay them to work in other places.
Absolutely.
So we need to raise the status of those individuals and to, treasure them rather more than we do at the moment. Callum, I wanted to come to you. Who decides what the priorities should be for clinical priorities should be for AI? Because at the moment, it seems to be a bit whimsical in that, you get a physician who's got a particular interest in AI and, off they rush with a company developing something, but it might not be, the most pressing clinical priority. How do you cope with that?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very clear exemplar of what some of the problems are. I think, as I mentioned, a lot of the way that decisions get made in medicine is actually intensely local, almost individual. And we're moving from that sort of environment to a much more systems level collection and analysis of data. And I think in that setting, you can imagine just even the existing business structures are not really fully fit for purpose. And so I think it's going to require a massive culture change. And one of the things we saw this in COVID that's been remarkably difficult to understand is why it is that there isn't some sort of simple architecture for prioritization at a national level in terms of public health and an international level in terms of public health, the way there is, for example, for tsunami or for earthquakes. We have not really thought about biomedicine in a global sense, even although we're all, as we've recognized, if we didn't know it before in the last 9 months, deeply connected. So I think it's going to require major culture change at the moment. I think, as I said, very individual. We need a much more systematic approach.
And part of that systematic approach presumably has to be to increase the understanding of AI by both clinicians and particularly hospital systems management, because unless they understand, then that's really going to be a real break to progress. And you'll get these, what I call physician fancies. that will be the thing that will power, rather than things which might actually be the most productive and useful for a particular system.
I agree. I think aligning it with resource allocation is a very good way to set it up. And you saw this even in COVID. I've yet to see a model that incorporates both the epidemiology of the disease and the economics of the locale. It would be nice to have integrated those at some stage in the last 9 months. Again, getting back to what Glenn said about all data, really healthcare data at the end of the day, we haven't really built the tools to allow that to happen.
Now, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I just wanted to intervene because of what Callum said about the COVID example. I think it's a very good example. We analyzed what studies were performed in medical imaging in general in the context of COVID, based on PubMed that was mentioned before and other archive papers, and what was done in AI. And we found that in the publications, there's a variety of studies about disease progression and detecting all kinds of complexities and complications that has to do with the disease. While in the AI, vast majority of the papers were about diagnosis, which is not recommended by the ACR and other organizations to use CT for diagnosis. And yet it's easier to analyze and easier to study. So many studies focused on that.
Precisely.
I was just going to say to our audience, we're already beginning to get some great questions in. So do please put your questions in, and we'll come to them in a while. And actually, Michal, I was also going to ask you, how do we prepare the health informatics for all of this? Because I'm sure it's not the case in Israel, where I know that you're remarkably advanced in this area, but the average hospital trust in the UK has 163 separate IT systems, and none of them talk to each other, let alone to anything else. You know, that's a kind of basic requisite for the development of AI. You know, a kind of universal Babel fish that is able to talk to all these systems and draw all that data together. How do we achieve that, given the constraints on funding within the systems?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I think if we talk about examples, I believe a very good example is what happens in Israel in the context of vaccination. So we have 4 HMOs that run the whole system, and we managed to vaccine up until today close to 2 million individuals in the country, which is a big portion of the country. And the reason is that everything is well organized through only 4 systems. And more than that, at least according to the news, I don't have any inside information, Pfizer has agreement to provide us earlier and more than previously agreed number of vaccinations that come to Israel. And the reason is, and again, according to publications, is the agreement of Israel to share the data. So as you said, sharing the data can make a big difference, even in the most important part or one of the important aspects of addressing the public health issue of COVID-19, of vaccination. If you can bring back value by understanding and learning from the data, then you can get priority on getting the vaccine, because then everybody can learn from these lessons of who benefits more and who benefits less. So I totally agree with you. It's a key to have access to data, and you need to have the right incentives in place, and guiding principles are first standardization. So there's a worldwide effort to standardize data through FHIR, which is a way to exchange data. And I think everybody who is active in this world should help progressing so that we all talk at the same language. That's very, very important, standardization. The other thing has to do with your previous question, your first question to Stefan about benefiting from AI. I think that having a very systematic approach is very important. So in order to see the value, if we go back to 400 years ago to Sir Francis Bacon, who introduced the scientific method, he provided a very rigorous way to benefit from science. He said, you have a question, you do a quick study, then you come up with an hypothesis, you explore it, you perform an experiment, and then you assess and report. And what we do in this 400 years later is that we have the opportunity to do it at scale. So companies like Netflix, Google, IBM, they do experimentation at scale in the context of our users. But we should benefit from that also in the AI world, in health, in public health issues. So we should have a consistent way to perform studies at scale, to run an experiment, show the value, and then it brings back the opportunities to have more hypotheses, where an hypothesis is an AI model that can benefit or cannot benefit. If it's being tested in a rigorous way, you can benefit from that, learn from that, and continuously increase that.
Let me turn to our lawyer, Glenn. What's the likelihood of standardization across the world, or even just across different health systems within the US or within the UK, in order to enable proper data collection, in order to help AI develop?
Thank you, Vivian. Whenever someone says, let me turn to the lawyer, it's like, let me give you the bad news. But in any event, here is the bad news, is that I think I'm pretty pessimistic about it within the United States. But part of this is also a question of what is kind of normatively and efficiency-wise optimal, right? So one big question at the heart of all this is, should patients have a right to say what happens with their data or not, right? And I think in COVID, it was very easy to view this in the lens of public health. This was publicly created data and stuff like that. But the true treasure troves of data are from much more quotidian encounters between individuals and a healthcare provider. And I think there's a real deep divide between people who think that it's enough to say, if you're part of my practice, we standardly collect this, we'll strip some identifiers and we'll ship it on. And people who think that no, in fact, there's some violence to my dignity or something done to me if you use my data without my consent. So I think that's a big thing we have to resolve. The other thing I think we have to think about here is just the question of how many silos of data is optimal. So it's clear to me from an efficiency perspective, having every hospital in America, or every hospital system having its own treasure trove of data that's not routinely shared, that's coded differently, is a disaster. But it also scares me, the idea that a huge player like a Google or an Apple could be the single repository for all the data in America, in part because they have, or the world, in part because they have so many other data sets in which we appear, and the ability to triangulate is pretty easy. So the optimal is probably somewhere in between, but that doesn't necessarily match either patient preferences or the way the economics of innovation actually line up.
Well, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to worry about big tech in this regard. I mean, one of the questions that we've got here is do you think that suspicion about the big tech companies invested in AI development will hold back acceptance of AI, or will we see more resistance from those whose jobs may be impacted? Let's get your thoughts on that first part of that question about suspicion about big tech.
Yeah, so I think, the COVID experience is interesting in that I think Google and Apple showed the ability to create something in record speed and something pretty good, and something that was extremely privacy sensitive, but actually self-defeating for that reason, because it had to position itself in such a way that was so privacy sensitive that my impression is a less privacy sensitive design would have done better. I think we're currently, the fact you asked this question today is fascinating, because right now we have a moment where Twitter, for example, and other major platforms are trying to get some credibility by upping their moderation choices in terms of white supremacists and the like. But I think that exact moment underscores the way in which they have become the de facto governments of today, right? They are the public squares, and they are the ones that control so much of the world. And to me, when they're doing a good job of it, we want to cheer them, but we should be scared as an underlying matter that they have so much power that they can do a good job or a bad job. And I think the average person should have that attitude towards healthcare as well. That when we have large companies that are very hard to regulate, that's a problem.
Yes, the irony of a corporation censoring the White House is not lost on us all. I want to come to this idea of the treasure trove of data. Thomas, let me come to you on that, because is it possible for there to be, these sort of open data in the development of drugs and vaccines? I mean, is pharma showing the way in this instance?
Yeah. I mean, we have to find the sweet spot between these two concerns: the enabling of technology, which is benefiting us all, and the difficulty of doing this on the expense of individuals. I think it is quite fascinating when 23andMe, a gene sequencing company, creates a spin-off with GlaxoSmithKline to exploit the data of millions of people who have given their agreement to use this also for research purposes. They certainly didn't think that a company would be using this to create the next medicines with a cutting-edge advantage. I think the important thing is that we are seeing a division now between those who are producing applications of AI, often in a commercial setting, and those who are using it. So I don't think we need all of our physicians to be trained on AI. We need good user interfaces to help them use AI, which was produced elsewhere, which is sufficiently standardized and quality controlled. And we probably need more institutions which are quality assuring this, who are validating, who are having lists of those which have shown to do a proper job. And also who are regulating that there is proper anonymization of the data which is available, that you cannot be re-identified from data, and that these data are properly curated and available to others to understand what's happening here. So I'm really calling for a validation body, for something which is helping us to see the gems in the AI space, which at the moment is a bit of the gold rush which is taking place.
Another question which I'd be grateful if you would answer briefly, which is from John Hill, is, and it goes back to your point about regulatory agencies. How do you educate the reviewer level of regulatory agencies and educating them on how to utilize the frameworks in evaluating regulatory submissions is critical? For example, the leaders of CDR have often been open to technologies and approaches that the reviewers are not.
This is exactly the point about validation. You cannot expect that each and every regulator can decide about the usefulness of and the appropriateness of a tool. They will in doubt just hesitate. If something big is at stake, they will say, I don't accept this data. They have not done this in the past. But in the field of alternatives to animal experiments, where I was heading the European Commission's validation body for a while, this is exactly what we can do. We can provide on a silver platter these evaluations by, in this case, AI experts who convene panels and come to a conclusion. Regulators, you can trust this. And which also have a record of which version has been evaluated. And are we really certain that the next version is not making things worse? We need a distribution of work. Not everybody should be AI specialists. We should all understand the basic principles, but this is enough if we have such help in infrastructure.
So can I turn to our two clinicians now, Callum and Stefan, because Glenn mentioned the treasure trove of data. And one of the things that we see all of the time is people wanting to hoard data to themselves because they see, papers and nature reviews, and all sorts of glories in their data set. Stefan, how do you stop that happening?
Well, that's a difficult question. Let me say that I think during COVID, I think people have had a common goal, massive pressure to save lives and economic impact, etc. And people pull together. I could see that in our university, in our hospital, that work has been done in a very short period of time that has not happened in years before, even though we knew we wanted to get there. So suddenly people could be brought in, experts on natural language processing to extract information from the free text from our electronic patient records. And COVID data sets were put together and made available for research use. So I think COVID has changed something. Because we had a common goal, but that hasn't overcome all the issues. I think, when it comes to publications, how do you recognize each person's contribution to this? I mean, people in our trust have had daily conference calls and lots of work in between to put this data set together. They're not typically the ones recognized on the papers. If they've contributed services, it's the researchers who then write the paper who get recognized. So I think this is a bigger problem, how you actually recognize people's contribution. I'd be interested to hear what Callum has to say to that.
Callum,
So
pass this difficult parcel over to you.
Yes, I think the fundamental problems are things we've talked about all through the session. They're the fact that at the moment, access control passes for intellectual contribution. We need the data collection itself is a task that is required to be pre-specified and undertaken rather than happening agnostically. And so those are the exact elements that introduce bias. We saw, for example, even in simple interpretation of COVID data, ranges of cardiac involvement from 70% to 0%. And trying to understand why it is that those types of problems have not been overcome for COVID, far less for all of the other common diseases that apply, is really an intrinsic problem in medicine. And I think the things that I believe will change it are the fact that as the scale of data that you require in order to be able to participate changes, people will recognize that building the architecture is just the price of entry, and that really it's creating the ideas and then testing these ideas and creating the ability to test these ideas that will be important. And then the other thing that will always drive change is outcomes. Once people start to see that outcomes are improving, then fundamentally the public will demand that we move beyond the current system. And I think some of this has been actively managed historically. It's nobody's fault. It's just a legacy property of the way that medicine has evolved over the last 300 years, is it is still very much intrinsically a one-to-one sport. And you talked earlier, Vivian, about, and as did Glenn, about the sanctity of the patient-doctor relationship. The sad thing is there are no data collected in those types of interactions that are worth using for AI. That doesn't mean to say they're not worth using for other activities, but for truly understanding the biology of a patient, they may not be that useful. And so we have to start to think about how we recreate what it is that all of the professionals in healthcare systems do. And what it shouldn't be is deciding what data to collect and then assembling these data post hoc in an attempt to answer questions that they themselves have had to think about before they started collecting the data. That cycle has to be disrupted, or we'll be stuck firmly in the 18th century for a long time to come.
Can you incentivize researchers with outcomes for patients? Forgive me for being slightly cynical, but but I sometimes think that actually you need, because the outcomes for patients are going to be down the road, and you need the incentives up front for researchers in order to get them to pull data.
I was careful to be circumspect in the way I used outcomes. So outcomes not just for patients, but also for researchers. If you look at many other fields, for example, physics, the data collection is orchestrated globally, and it's the post hoc analysis and the planning for the next cycle that ends up being the academic activity. So I think it's all about redesigning what it is that's valued, and that really is aligning outcomes and incentives.
Incentives, Michal, for researchers, what would you offer?
So I totally agree with Callum that there's a need to reshape and think about that. I can just share some examples of how we created incentives that were not there originally. For instance, there's a whole not-for-profit organization called the Dream Challenge. And the Dream Challenge put in place agreements between different organizations so the data is being collected consistently between different providers, sometimes in different locations. And there's a multidisciplinary team that poses a question and challenges the community. And the community incentive in that case is that you get the glory of solving something that was not solved before. So it is posed in a way that it's collected in the right way and so on. And then, of course, achieving the publication in the right place. And often people are simply competitive. So the fact that you put in place something and you allow a benchmark to everybody to compare themselves is another way to create incentives. So this is among the tools of the community in order to create and drive research questions in the directions that matter to the public.
So that's the question of incentives, but and I open this to anybody on the panel. Do you think that actually what this is driving us towards, and Frontiers is as an example here, is open science? I mean, it's really essential if we are to have properly developed AI solutions to many of the problems in medicine. Let's hear from Thomas.
I mean, we're living in the 21st century, and the 21st century is about sharing, about openness, transparency. That's what is expected by society. They are suspicious of the elites which are communicating behind paywalls and closed doors, and also in slang, which they cannot understand. I think that open access is part of this. And we should also not forget that the scientific literature itself is fed to AI. We are producing 2 million articles listed in PubMed in the biomedical area, and this is likely only about a quarter of what is being produced scientifically. That's a treasure trove, but we cannot really mine it because many of these things are not accessible, they are costly, and they're not published in a sufficiently standardized way with structured abstracts, sufficient mesh terms, text, and whatever, that we can actually have the computer read them. Who is going to read the 90,000 articles on COVID-19 and make sense of them? If we do not employ tools which are condensing this, this will be problematic. And what we have impressively seen that the model of open access publishing, which Frontiers is spearheading, is the thing every publisher agreed on for COVID-19. When it really counts, suddenly everything can be published as open access. Are the other diseases less important? No. I mean, I don't see a reason why we can hold back and work for free for publishers, as reviewers, as authors, and so on. And then afterwards, everybody pays for getting to see it. So I'm really very much convinced that this is a driving force for the science in the 21st century.
Thank you, Callum. There are going to be a lot of challenges for the future. What do you think the vested interests are that may provide challenge? Because on the one hand, definitely we need AI in terms of the workforce that is, healthcare workforce is very small. It needs to grow. There aren't enough healthcare professionals around the world to cope. So we need AI to help there. But AI may be seen as a threat rather than as an opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. I think Thomas alluded to it earlier. Drug discoverers being replaced by AI versus drug discoverers who work with AI replacing those who do not. And I think ultimately the vested interests are really in every sphere. I don't think it's unusual in biomedicine. I do think that there are some particularly unusual barriers because of the traditional nature and the way in which healthcare has been managed. But many of those are learned behavior on the part of the patient and the physician. As many of the folks on the call will have done, worked through the early days of the HIV pandemic, where nobody wanted to know the results of their testing. You had to consent everybody to get tested. You had to consent separately to put the data in the record. As soon as there was an effective treatment, all of that dissipated. So I think a lot of this is going to be a function of showing people, I think Thomas put it very well, it's breaking down the barriers of transparency, showing people how AI compares with the existing systems. And once we begin to show that everybody's performance, patients, physicians, payers, governments, drug discoverers, and pharma companies all improve in parallel, I think it will become easier to break it down. But I do think everybody will have some vested interest in preventing change. I think people like their current routines too much. And so replacing that with a routine that you can't fully get your mind around is going to be very difficult.
And they like resisting as well. I want to take more questions from the audience. I can tell you that there are 458 of you out there from 73 countries. So hello. How lovely it is to have you with us today. So here's an interesting question. This comes from Ricardo Gonzalez Mendez. I'm not quite sure what country you are listening from, but an important issue has been the reliance on data on paper forms, even if in digital formats like PDF, from small community-based healthcare facilities, small clinical labs, such as fax. The NHS is still the largest user of fax machines in the world, that have been extremely reliable, but no compatible automated data collection. Change requires large investments by and retraining of healthcare personnel. Can you comment on this? And Michal, let's go to you on that one.
Let me see that I got it right, Vivian. I need your help. So the question is about the PDF and the non-standard way that records are.
Yeah, I'm guessing what this. And forgive me, Ricardo, if I'm interpreting your question for you. But I think what we have here is that there's a huge amount of data, and it goes to Glenn's iceberg. There's a huge amount of data that isn't routinely included in data collection because it's, I guess, small beer stuff that comes from small clinics, but nevertheless together it's very important. How do you incorporate that kind of very valuable data, given that that's the data that also requires most public investment to get to a format that is AI readable or compatible?
So I think that technology made a leapfrog on that front. So I've seen that 10 years ago, when we wanted to learn from data that is in PDF, it was originally typed. It was okay, but not so smooth, and there were many mistakes. But recently, even if it's handwritten, you can map that and analyze that. So we have, I'm familiar with many cases where we are recording phone discussions using speech-to-text technology and then benefiting from the textual data in order to learn from that. And I am aware of many cases where we learn from PDF scans and we map them to a digital format that is consumable by the systems. So I believe that if in the past many of the communication ways were not addressable and couldn't be incorporated in analysis, nowadays the story is different. Still, obviously, there's a big difference between having one big data set sitting in an organized fashion in one place and collecting and mapping the data. It's different investments, and yet it's possible, and I see people benefiting from that. There's also, I saw analysis of SMSs that has many typos, as you know, on alerting on disease cases in Africa where people send SMSs, and you can learn about the public health status from this. So I think that the technology in that sense have made big jumps, and you can benefit from that.
As heaven help us if AI is being trained on predictive texting.
I mean, we have to understand this is getting bigger and bigger. The largest linguistic model, GPM3, was trained on the entire internet as a source. Yeah, and that's mind blowing. Yeah, and they produced the best model to date. Yeah, but this is behind the paywall now of a company. It's exclusively licensed to Microsoft. Is this good? Where this could be useful in so many instances.
Okay. We're going to leave that hanging there because I'm anxious to get some more questions in. There's a very good question here from Innocent Nawachukwu, and I hope I pronounced your name right, Innocent. I want to know how AI can be applied in antibiotic testing and other relevant aspects of diagnostic microbiology. Who would like to take that? There's a bit of a conspicuous lack of response here, Innocent.
No, I think that there was this discussion about the pharma that I believe we already talked, and Thomas mentioned that, and also Callum. So there's opportunity to learn on antibiotics from data in various ways. There's the data of the patients themselves, so you can learn retrospectively if this is a molecule that is already out there. That's one way. So we learn from the clinical data, the images, and so on. And then there's a very different way of mining the literature that Thomas just mentioned, where you want to learn about a potential activity and functionality and mechanism of action of a new molecule, and you can compare its chemical structure to other molecules that were found effective and to learn about their intervention in the pathways. So I've seen many pharma companies who are benefiting from AI in that way, in learning the literature through AI and mapping the chemical structures through AI. There's a lot to do there, many opportunities.
Quick question for you, Callum. This is from Tez Mercer. Looking back, what went wrong in AI or other modelling to predict COVID-19 in Africa? Most models predicted 70 million infections and 2 to 3 million dead.
I mean, I think the things that strike me that are missing are, the input data from the right venues, the types of data that might be relevant in other societies may not be nearly so relevant in Africa. But also just simple things in other ambient data that were intrinsically part of the way that the models were built in the West, just community structure, the way that people travel, how people interact. Those are all very different. And so even simple indices such as the reproductive index of infection are quite discrete in different cultures. And that's been well described in many other epidemic situations.
And I think this is a recurring theme in many of the questions. How do you see AI aiding health in developing countries where internet connections are weak? And that comes from Charles McKenzie, Task Force for Global Health in Atlanta. Who'd like to take? Again, looking at you again, Callum.
I mean, again, one of the most amazing things is the fact that cell phone technologies are leapfrogging, I think, the traditional infrastructure deployment. That's not to minimize their availability in the developing world, but I do believe that things will be accelerated by essentially bypassing a couple of decades of infrastructure rollout in much the same way as happened in China with Wi-Fi services and cellular completely disrupting any landline technology that would have been required in the past. So short answer is currently constrained, but I do think there's a huge amount of hope that simple data collected from personal devices that are available to the consumer at low cost will actually supersede many traditional medical metrics in predicting, managing illness.
This is a question for Stefan Peterson. This is from Robert Toto. As a clinician, I found Dr. Peterson's point regarding collaboration between clinicians and AI scientists very important, even beyond COVID-19. My question is, what strategies or methods does he recommend or has found helpful to encourage and exalt such collaborations? Stefan, how do you recruit people? How do you bring them over?
I mean, I guess from my own experience, I started off at some point not knowing what AI is at all, and I basically just self-trained, read a lot, and talk to computer scientists and soak up information. And at the beginning, when I got into this field, I had no idea how AI could even be used in healthcare. And I brought a group of people together to discuss this related to cardiac imaging, to even work out what use cases could be. So I think what I've gone through, and I'm still going through, is we just need to basically explain use cases. And once people start seeing where the opportunities lie, I think they'll come up with their own ideas. So what you want clinicians to do is really develop use cases that then could be tackled by AI people. And I think you need to learn the lingo a little bit to be able to communicate with the computer scientists. And I think this is an important thing. Even if you sort of at the outset communicate with the AI people, this needs to be an iterative process. This is from my own experience. I think if you sort of completely step back and then just wait for the result in the end, you often find that it's gone off-piste a little bit. And so it's important to sort of look at initial results and fine-tune throughout. I don't know whether that answers the question, but that's kind of what I'm thinking.
And Glenn, I was wondering actually what the role of the patient is in all of this, because the conversations that just have the clinician on one side and the computer scientist on the other, with no patient interface or involvement, seem to me to be a recipe for future problems.
Certainly in the trust question, if patients are being subjected to AI without having a role, without having it been disclosed, it's a real problem. And all the literature on algorithm aversion shows the more of an active opportunity you give to patients to see the fragility of models, to see how small changes make a difference, the more trust and buy-in you get. But I have to say, when it comes to the data, I don't see us moving to a place where every individual patient gets to decide whether every individual piece of data is used or not. That's just not the way the system is being set up by the powerful players right now.
Yeah, but it also, as you say, the whole foundation of this is trust. This is a question, perhaps I think this might be for Michal. It's from Ava Liss. What are your suggestions for standardizing publishing methods to make research data more usable for AI? Should there be 2 required publication formats, one for humans and one for computers?
That's a good question, and Thomas actually already alluded to that. Yes, and structured abstracts and keywords, all of that is very, very useful and important. And I think that beyond the publication, we see that lately in many of the papers. There was a Nature paper talking about AI in radiology, the importance of sharing the algorithm and the data so that you can really benchmark your technology. So I think that it's key and important that we can compare. So if there was some standard that you request open source, and there are journals who ask that, and sometimes there are good reasons not to provide it. But if it becomes more and more standard that the code is open source, the data, if available, and if given all the limitations that was discussed before, whatever can be shared is shared, then it will be much easier to mine and compare the results, because often it's not comparable. You see results and you can't really understand where they are.
So, Thomas, is your particular journal that you edit for Frontiers, are you insisting on a format that is AI readable?
It is an increase. Let's say it's a continuing process to improve on this. The traditional publishers have to learn that they have the opportunity to share more, which could be starting with the acknowledgement of people who are not authors but who have contributed. We could have something like at the end of a movie where the guy who brought the sandwiches is recognized. It is going towards the data. It is going towards the algorithms. It's about sharing. It is about the metadata, which is often very critical. Because you can throw out all of the data without the right information, what they mean and how they were collected. They're completely useless. And these are processes which are enormously accelerating. We have seen this over the last decade. Publishing is changing. And I think that the journals which are using on these technologies should also be on the forefront and adopting the quality assurance and good practices here.
Okay, a question which I think is absolutely in Callum's bag here, which is about, this is from Agnesh Awemoye. Thanks for your talks. My question relates to the utility of AI in individualized medicine or healthcare for pathologies that occur as different syndromes.
So again, I think it's an obvious example of where I can actually have really dramatic effects. I think what we're beginning to see is that a lot of the classic disease syndromes were defined really on patterns of recognition that were feasible in a short single interaction and can be anticipated many years earlier if you collect data in an agnostic fashion and use AI to essentially learn as the trajectories evolve. You can anticipate data that are predictive of classic syndromes many years before all of the features are available. There are some great examples in the literature. Rahul Deo, who works with me, just published a paper predicting a particular form of heart disease on average several years before it's conceivable to predict it using the naked eye. Those types of things, I think, are going to be very tractable across all of medicine in the long haul. And it may be that, exactly as Glenn said, a lot of the data that we imagine informing diagnosis are actually already being collected in other venues in a much more rigorous and continuous way than they're currently collected in medicine.
And again, Glenn, I'm going to you on that, because that's a real opportunity for patient involvement. Because if patients feel that by contributing their data in a certain way, they will be contributing to earlier diagnosis of a disease that may have claimed other members of their family, then that's a very, very powerful way to lead by example.
Absolutely, but the thickness of the community matters in the way you framed it, right? When I feel it's about me and about people I care about, it's one thing. When I feel as though I am helping a system in general and don't see the value coming back to me, it's much less likely to motivate people towards action.
Yeah, absolutely. We've kind of got to the end of our time. It's not, for our audience, the end of your interaction with us, I hope, because we'd very much like you to come to the live networking session that we're going to be hosting after this event, and participants can connect with each other on all the topics that we've been talking about today. I want to close this part of our event by thanking our contributors. I'm sure you'll agree with me that they've been fantastic. It's rare that you get this opportunity, have these real world examples, and to talk about AI in a way that actually is beyond the hype, with the worked examples that we've seen during the pandemic. One thing that I think is absolutely certain that's come out of this is that there's no going back. I think the pandemic has made permanent changes to the way that we operate our health systems, the way that we think about our health, and particularly about regulation, which will lead, I think, to many policy changes in the future. I want to thank Frontiers, and I also want to thank Keystone for their collaboration that's allowed all of us to come together today and to talk about this very important subject. Participants, contributors, Frontiers, Keystone, thank you so much.